You clicked because you heard that Cleopatra, the most famous Egyptian queen in history, was not Egyptian. That fact is true, and it is only the first contradiction in a case 2,000 years old. Look at the evidence. Put a classical painting of Cleopatra side by side with her coin portrait. The painting shows a voluptuous, dark-eyed woman, dressed in exotic finery, gazing out with smoldering allure. The coin shows something else. A strong profile, a prominent nose, a stern jaw, no softness. No invitation. The coin was struck during her lifetime, under her authority. The painting was made more than 1,600 years after her death. We have a conflict of evidence. The woman on the coin was a queen who ruled Egypt for 21 years. She was the last of the Ptolemaic dynasty. And that dynasty was not Egyptian. It was Greek-Macedonian, founded by a general of Alexander the Great. For nearly 300 years, this family ruled the Nile without bothering to learn the language of the people they governed. They married their own siblings to keep the bloodline pure. They lived in a Greek city, Alexandria, built on the Egyptian shore but facing the Mediterranean. They were foreigners presiding over the oldest continuous civilization on Earth. And then, in the 1st century before the Common Era, one of them decided to become more Egyptian than any Egyptian pharaoh. Her name was Cleopatra VII Philopator, and the image she built, and the image Rome built against her, would fuse into the most durable romantic legend in Western history. But how did she become Egypt's icon? Why the seductress myth? But the physical evidence tells a different story, one that culminates in a queen's final strategic performance. The case begins with a general. Ptolemy, son of Lagus, later Ptolemy I Soter. When Alexander the Great died in Babylon in 323 BCE, his empire fractured. Ptolemy took Egypt. He understood the value of the land. The regular flooding of the Nile produced grain surpluses that could fund armies. He seized Alexander's body as it was being transported to Macedonia and brought it to Memphis, then to Alexandria, making the city a sacred capital. By 305 BCE, he declared himself king, not a Macedonian satrap, but a pharaoh. On the temple walls, he carved his image in Egyptian style, wearing the double crown. But in his court, the language was Greek, the administration was Greek, the soldiers were Greek, the library and the museum were Greek. The dynasty's power came from lightning conquest and a Greek-speaking elite. They did not need to be Egyptian. They needed to be feared and fed. This pattern held for 270 years. Ptolemy after Ptolemy spoke Greek, lived in the royal quarter at Alexandria, and ruled the countryside through a Greek bureaucracy. They adopted the Egyptian royal title of Pharaoh when it suited them, depicted themselves in traditional Egyptian costume on temple reliefs, paid lip service to the gods. But they did not speak the language. They did not worship as Egyptians. They married within their own family, brother to sister, to prevent Egyptian blood from entering the royal line. The native population was taxed, conscripted, and kept at arm's length. The evidence is in the papyri, legal documents, land registries, decrees, all in Greek. Below the court, a whole country operated in Demotic Egyptian. The two worlds barely touched. The Ptolemies were rulers of Egypt, not rulers in Egypt. They camped on the throne. Now look at the coins. Every Ptolemy minted coins with their portrait. The Greek style is unmistakable. Strong profiles, diademed heads, inscriptions in Greek. In 200 years, not a single Egyptian hieroglyph appears on a Ptolemaic coin, not a single Egyptian symbol. The dynasty's official face was turned toward the Aegean, not the Nile. That is the pattern. And then comes the anomaly. Cleopatra VII became co-ruler with her father, Ptolemy XII Auletes, in 51 BCE. She was 18 years old by modern counting. By the time she emerged as sole ruler after dynastic bloodshed, she had done something no previous Ptolemy had managed. She learned the Egyptian language. Ancient sources, including Plutarch, writing a century and a half later, claim she could speak 9 languages, but the one that mattered was Egyptian. She was the first of her line, whose voice could be understood by the priests and the people without an interpreter. The political calculation was clear. The dynasty was weak. Rome was growing more powerful and more intrusive. Egypt was restless. To hold the throne, she needed to be seen as legitimate in the eyes of her subjects. So she transformed herself into the goddess Isis. Isis was the mother goddess, the protector of the dead, the giver of life. Cleopatra adopted her iconography. In statues, she appeared with the sun disk and cow horns of Isis. In inscriptions, she was called Necherit Meretes, goddess beloved of her father. She minted coins in Alexandria that showed her as a queen, not a goddess, but with a profile that fit Egyptian royal conventions. The aquiline nose, the simple diadem, the hair in a bun. When she wanted to be seen as Pharaoh, she donned the symbols. When she needed to be seen by Romans, she posed as a Hellenistic monarch. The evidence suggests a deliberate, segmented image. Different faces for different audiences. But the coin portrait is the hardest evidence we have. It was struck from dies engraved by craftsmen who saw her or worked from official likenesses. It shows a woman with a strong, curved nose, a pronounced chin, and deep-set eyes. No ancient source says she was physically beautiful in the modern sense. Plutarch writes that her beauty was not in itself altogether incomparable, a polite way of saying she was not a great beauty by the standards of the day. He then adds, but converse with her had an irresistible charm, and her presence, combined with the persuasiveness of her speech and the character which was somehow diffused about her behavior towards others, had something stimulating about it. Her voice, he says, was like a many-stringed instrument. She could turn a phrase, she could read a room, she could make a man feel like the only man in the world. That is the weapon she wielded, not classical perfection. And yet the romantic image of the sultry queen persists. It persists because her enemies created it. Turn the page to Rome. In 48 BCE, the Roman Civil War spilled onto Egyptian soil. Pompey the Great, fleeing Caesar, arrived at Alexandria and was murdered by the young King Ptolemy XIII, Cleopatra's brother and rival. Caesar arrived in pursuit, took up residence in the royal palace, and demanded repayment of debts. Cleopatra was in exile, driven out by her brother's faction. She needed back in. What happened next became legend, and the legend is usually wrong. The story says she had her servant Apollodorus wrap her in a carpet, which was then unrolled at Caesar's feet, revealing the queen in a dramatic entrance. Plutarch, again, is the source, but he does not say carpet. He says bedding bag, a sack made of bedclothes. The Greek word is stromatodesmo. She was smuggled in, carried by Apollodorus into Caesar's presence in the palace. Not a carpet, not a seductive unrolling, a tactical insertion. Caesar was 49 years old, she was 21. He saw the political advantage, an allied monarch who could supply grain, gold, and the legitimacy of an ancient throne. She saw Roman military muscle that could crush her brother's forces and restore her as sole ruler. The alliance formed. Caesar defeated Ptolemy XIII, who drowned in the Nile during the battle. Cleopatra was reinstalled, married to another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, but the real power rested with her and Caesar. She gave birth to a son in 47 BCE. She named him Caesarion Little Caesar. She claimed him as Caesar's child, and she had coins minted in Cyprus depicting herself as Isis with the infant Horus, a clear parallel to her divine motherhood. For Caesar, publicly acknowledging the boy was politically inconvenient. He already had a legitimate wife in Rome. But the child was a piece on the board. If Caesar accepted him, Egypt might gain a Roman heir. Cleopatra even traveled to Rome in 46 BCE, took up residence in a villa across the Tiber, and lived there as a foreign dignitary with her son. Senators grumbled. The presence of an Egyptian queen with a child bearing Caesar's name was a provocation. Then, on the Ides of March, 44 BCE, Caesar was assassinated. The political calculation collapsed. Cleopatra fled back to Egypt. Soon after, Ptolemy XIV died, probably poisoned, and she raised Caesarion as co-ruler. She needed a new Roman patron. The obvious choice was Mark Antony. Antony was Caesar's lieutenant, a burly soldier with a taste for Eastern luxury. In 41 BCE, he summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus in Cilicia, modern Turkey, to answer charges that she had aided his enemies. She arrived not as a supplicant, but as a spectacle. Plutarch describes the scene. She sailed up the Cydnus River in a barge with a gilded stern, purple sails, silver oars, flute players, and attendants dressed as nymphs and cupids. She reclined beneath a canopy, adorned as Venus. The crowd gathered, the word spread, and Antony, who presented himself as the new Dionysus, was captivated. The scene is visually overwhelming. It was designed to be. She was not a seductress. She was a ruler negotiating an alliance. The meeting secured their alliance. They formed a partnership that was both political and personal, producing 3 children over the next decade. She called them Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus. The names invoked sun, moon, and the founder of the dynasty. The alliance infuriated Octavian, Caesar's great-nephew and adopted son, who controlled the Western Roman Empire. Octavian and Antony had divided the Roman world, but their rivalry was escalating. Octavian seized on Cleopatra as the perfect weapon. The campaign began in 34 BCE with the donations of Alexandria. In a grand ceremony, Antony distributed eastern territories to Cleopatra's children, effectively carving up Roman provinces and client kingdoms in her name. It was an act of breathtaking arrogance. Octavian pounced. He had his propagandists. Men like Horace and the poets gathered around Maecenas, cast the whole affair not as a political dispute between Roman generals, but as a war between virtuous Roman manhood and decadent Eastern degeneracy. Cleopatra was recast as the oriental femme fatale, the foreign queen who had bewitched a once great Roman soldier, turned him effeminate, lured him into abandoning Roman values for Egyptian luxury and cult. The coinage joined the attack. Antony minted denarii bearing his portrait on one side and Cleopatra's on the other. The first time a living foreign queen appeared on Roman coinage. It was a statement of partnership, but Octavian's men read it as proof of enslavement. Octavian himself struck coins showing a crocodile and the legend Egypto capta, Egypt captured, even before the war had begun. The coin war was the prelude to the real one. Every Roman of the ruling class heard the same message. Antony was no longer Roman. He had become Egyptian. He had gone native. And the agent of his corruption was a woman whose ancestors had conquered nothing, whose body was a weapon, whose ambitions threatened the Senate and the people of Rome. The charges were false, but they were vivid. And they stuck. The seductive Cleopatra of legend, the woman who supposedly ruined 2 of Rome's greatest men with her beauty, was not an Egyptian invention. It was Roman propaganda, designed to justify the destruction of an inconvenient queen and the annexation of her kingdom. The image would outlive Octavian, outlive the Roman Empire, and fuse with later fantasies to become the Cleopatra we think we know today. But the evidence from her lifetime, the coins, the statues, the decrees, shows us a different person. A ruler who methodically constructed an identity to match the needs of her throne, and then faced a propaganda campaign that turned her into a monster. The question now is whether that image war would become a real one. And the evidence suggests the answer was just off the coast of Greece, at a place called Actium. Actium, a promontory on the west coast of Greece, on the southern edge of the Ambracian Gulf. In early September of 31 BCE, 2 fleets gathered there. One belonged to Octavian, commanded in the field by Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. The other belonged to Mark Antony and Cleopatra. The war that had been fought with coins, poems, and whispers in the Senate was about to become a war of timber, bronze rams, and human blood. The numbers tell part of the story. Antony and Cleopatra had assembled a force of around 500 warships, many of them massive quinquiremes, along with a land army of perhaps 100,000 men. They had outposts along the western coast of Greece and supply lines stretching back to Egypt. Octavian's fleet under Agrippa was smaller but more maneuverable. Agrippa had already cut Antony's supply lines by seizing key positions to the south. By the time the two fleets faced each other inside the Gulf, Antony's men were hungry, sick, and increasingly demoralized. Desertions had been climbing for weeks. The exact plan of the battle is still debated. The surviving written sources, Plutarch, Cassius Dio, were compiled more than a century later, long after Octavian had consolidated power. What they give us is an official version. According to that version, Antony intended to break out of the blockade and retreat to Egypt. Cleopatra commanded her own squadron of 60 ships, stationed behind Antony's line. At a critical moment, her squadron raised sails, cut through the fighting, and fled south. Antony, seeing her leave, abandoned his own flagship, transferred to a smaller vessel, and followed. His fleet collapsed soon after. The army, stranded on shore, held out for a week before surrendering. That is the narrative Octavian's historians wanted. It paints Cleopatra as a coward who fled and Antony as a broken man who chased a woman rather than command his men. But there are physical details that complicate this. Antony and Cleopatra's ships had been rigged with sails before the battle, an unusual decision for a fleet expecting to fight, because sails were heavy and were normally left on shore to keep warships light and agile. The fact that they carried sails suggests the breakout was prearranged. It was not panic, it was a plan. And the squadron that escaped included Cleopatra's flagship with Egypt's war chest, the money to raise another army if they made it back to Alexandria. The breakout failed politically, but it was not a random act of betrayal. The evidence from Actium is fragmentary. We do not have the dead men's letters or the tactical signals recorded in real time. What we have is a result. Antony and Cleopatra escaped with perhaps one-third of their fleet. The remainder burned or was captured. The land army walked over to Octavian. Within a year, Octavian had marched through Syria and Phoenicia, accepting surrenders and approaching Egypt's eastern border. Antony's remaining legions in Cyrenaica defected. By the summer of 30 BCE, Octavian was outside Alexandria. What happened next has been replayed in 1,000 paintings, but the physical record is almost silent about the final days. We have the underwater ruins of the royal quarter at Alexandria, the limestone blocks of the palaces, fallen columns, scattered amphorae in the silt. We can map the streets and the harbor, but the final scenes inside those walls are lost unless we trust the written accounts, and those were composed by the winners. According to the narrative Octavian's regime later sanctioned, Antony, believing Cleopatra already dead, stabbed himself with his own sword. Plutarch adds that he was then hauled up through a window to her mausoleum, where he died in her presence. For Cleopatra, the end came a few days later. Octavian had taken the city. He wanted her alive for his triumph in Rome, to be paraded through the streets in chains. She negotiated, she delayed, but the sources agree she chose to die. How she died is one of the most contested questions in ancient history. The standard version says she arranged for an asp, a venomous snake, likely an Egyptian cobra, to be smuggled into her chamber in a basket of figs. The snake bit her arm or her breast. 2 of her handmaidens died with her. Octavian's men found her laid out in royal robes, already dead. That is the story. But the earliest source, Strabo, writing within a generation or two, admits he does not know whether she died by a serpent's bite or by a poisoned ointment applied with a needle or a hairpin. Plutarch, writing a century later, repeats both possibilities. Cassius Dio mentions the asp, but also the application of poison to a wound. No autopsy was conducted. The bodies were not preserved. The chamber, the mausoleum, has never been identified. The asp is an emblem, not a confirmed cause of death. And yet the asp persists. It persists because it was useful. In Egyptian royal iconography, the cobra, the uraeus, was a symbol of divine authority and protection, worn on the crowns of pharaohs. To die by an asp was to die by the very symbol of Egyptian kingship, an act that fused the queen with the goddess she had claimed to embody. For Octavian, who needed to present Cleopatra as an Egyptian menace that had finally been subdued, the death by a serpent story turned her suicide into a poetic defeat. The last Ptolemy brought low by the very symbol of the land she had usurped. The story was too good to check. For the Romans, that image wrapped the entire Egyptian adventure in a neat bow. A foreign queen, descended from a Macedonian general, had tried to seduce and corrupt Rome with Eastern luxury and mystic gods. She had failed. Her death, by Egypt's own deadly emblem, proved the point. Octavian had the mausoleum sealed and Egypt turned into a Roman province, his personal possession, the breadbasket of the empire. Cleopatra's 3 surviving children by Antony were taken to Rome and marched in the triumph, then raised by Octavian's sister Octavia. Caesarion, her son by Caesar, was hunted down and killed before he could claim a rival inheritance. The dynasty was extinct, but the story was only beginning. Over the next 2,000 years, the Roman propaganda image of Cleopatra, the oriental seductress, the exotic queen, the woman who ruined great men, did not disappear. It metamorphosed. In the hands of Roman poets like Horace and Propertius, she was already a monster, a drunkard, a fatal woman. The later historian Cassius Dio, writing in the 3rd century CE, gave her a speech intended to demonstrate her manipulative wiles. That Roman caricature was the raw material. When the Roman Empire fell and the Middle Ages had little access to Egyptian sources, the Roman version was the only version. Medieval writers, looking back at ancient history through a Christian lens, turned Cleopatra into a moral lesson about the dangers of feminine allure and worldly power. Chaucer mentions her as an example of tragic love. Boccaccio includes her in his collection of famous women as a figure of ambition and ruin. Then came the Renaissance, and with it, a renewed fascination with classical antiquity. Painters like Giambattista Tiepolo and Alessandro, Allori depicted her death as a sensual, highly theatrical scene. Bared breast, languid posture, a servant slipping the snake toward her. The Orientalist imagination added turbans, silks, dark-eyed attendants, a haze of incense and perfume. None of this had any archaeological basis, but it had a strong narrative pull. The asp, the bare skin, the tragic beauty, these became the visual shorthand for Cleopatra. William Shakespeare's play Antony and Cleopatra, written around 1607, fused the Roman material with Renaissance drama. His Cleopatra is magnificent, mercurial, and doomed. Her suicide becomes an erotic and poetic act. Give me my robe, put on my crown, I have immortal longings in me. Shakespeare's lines are so powerful that for many audiences, they became the definitive Cleopatra. The fact that Shakespeare was drawing on Plutarch's already propagandistic life of Antony made no difference. Art had swallowed history. In the 20th century, cinema took the same raw material and amplified it further. Theda Bara vamped through a silent Cleopatra in 1917. Claudette Colbert played her as a sly flirt in 1934. But the most influential version was the 1963 film starring Elizabeth Taylor. That production cost an enormous amount of money and nearly bankrupted the studio. But it cemented the image in the public mind for a generation. Heavy eye makeup, a cascade of dark hair, lavish costumes, and a doomed romance with Richard Burton's Antony. The movie was not about a political strategist trying to save a kingdom. It was a love story. The tagline read, "The motion picture the world has been waiting for, a world of beauty and evil, of passion and violence." Even the marketing reproduced the Roman propaganda frame. Beauty, evil, passion. At each step, the layers accumulated. The Roman smear campaign gave way to Renaissance Orientalism. Renaissance Orientalism gave way to Hollywood spectacle. The coin portrait, the one physical artifact that shows us her face, sat in museum drawers while the paintings and the movies filled the screen. The woman with the aquiline nose and the strong jaw was replaced by a fantasy. But under all those layers, what remains of the actual woman? The real Cleopatra VII Philopator was a Macedonian Greek by ancestry, yes. But she was also the first Ptolemy, and arguably the only one who fully grasped that a dynasty that had ruled for nearly 300 years on Egyptian soil could no longer afford to stand apart. She learned the language. She performed the rituals. She minted coins that paired her Greek diadem with Egyptian titles. She presented herself as the living Isis. Whether that was a purely cynical calculation or a genuine identification is a question we cannot fully answer from the evidence. What we can say is that it worked. For 2 decades, she held off the collapse of her dynasty against overwhelming odds, navigating Roman civil wars, famines, court conspiracies, and a sibling rivalry that had nearly killed her. She used every tool at her disposal: politics, diplomacy, spectacle, motherhood, and yes, personal alliances with the 2 most powerful men in Rome. To call those alliances love stories is to misunderstand the stakes. Caesar and Antony were not simply seduced. They were, each in turn, invited into a strategic partnership that promised military support now and a shared dominion later. Cleopatra needed legions. They needed Egyptian grain and treasure. The romance, where it existed, was the least interesting part of the transaction. Octavian understood this perfectly well. That is precisely why he had to turn the transaction into a seduction. It was safer for him if Romans believed Antony had been ensorcelled by a foreign woman than to admit Antony had made a rational geopolitical choice that threatened Rome's constitution. And so we arrive at the final verdict. Cleopatra lost the military war. She lost Egypt. Her dynasty ended with her death, and Octavian's Rome swallowed the last independent Hellenistic kingdom. But in the longer war, the war of images, the war of stories, she did something remarkable. She weaponized her own myth. Whether or not she chose the asp, the story of that death was the final performance of a woman who had spent her entire reign performing identity. She died as she had lived, by making herself into a symbol. The Romans tried to make that symbol a monster, but they could not control what happened after. The monster became an icon. The seductress became a tragic heroine. The propaganda turned into a legend that outlived the empire that created it. Look again at that coin. The profile with the strong nose, the pronounced chin, the practical hair pulled back under a diadem. There is no seduction in that face. There is resolve. It is the face of a survivor who adapted, who outlasted her brothers, her rivals, and nearly outlasted Rome itself. When she died, she was 39 years old. She had ruled for 21 years. She had transformed herself from a Greek princess in a foreign land into the most famous pharaoh Egypt ever produced, even though she was not Egyptian. The real Cleopatra was not a victim of propaganda. She was a master of it. Her enemies built a cage of lies around her. She turned that cage into a throne, and then she died inside it, on her own terms, in a performance so complete that 20 centuries later, we are still trying to find the woman beneath the story. The coin is all that's left that is undeniably her, and the coin does not lie.